saying that St. Catherine had forbidden her to do it, but forgave her afterwards for her disobedience. Joan summed up. We may accept and admire Joan, then, as a sane and shrewd country girl of extraordinary strength of mind and hardihood of body. Everything she did was thoroughly calculated, and though the process was so rapid that she was hardly conscious of it, and ascribed it all to her voices, she was a woman of policy and not of blind impulse. In war she was as much a realist as Napoleon. She had his eye for artillery and his knowledge of what it could do. She did not expect besieged cities to fall Jericho-wise at the sound of her trumpet, but like Wellington, adapted her methods of attack to the peculiarities of the defense. And she anticipated the Napoleonic calculation that if you only hold on long enough, the other fellow will give in. For example, her final triumph at Orleans was achieved after her commander Dunois had sounded the retreat at the end of a day's fighting without a decision. She was never for a moment what so many romancers and playwrights have pretended, a romantic young lady. She was a thorough daughter of the soil in her peasant-like matter-of-factness and doggedness, and her acceptance of great lords and kings and prelates as such without idolatry or snobbery, seeing at a glance how much they were individually good for. She had the respectable countrywoman's sense of the value of public decency, and would not tolerate foul language and neglect of religious observance, nor allow disreputable women to hang about her soldiers. She had one pious ejaculation, "En nom de," and one meaningless oath, "Par mon matin," and this much swearing she allowed to the incorrigibly blasphemous Layard, equally with herself. The value of this prudery was so great in restoring the self-respect of the badly demoralized army that, like most of her policy, it justified itself as soundly calculated. She talked to and dealt with people of all classes, from laborers to kings, without embarrassment or affectation, and got them to do what she wanted when they were not afraid or corrupt. She could coax and she could hustle, her tongue having a soft side and a sharp edge. She was very capable, a born boss. Joan's immaturity and ignorance. All this, however, must be taken with one heavy qualification. She was only a girl in her teens. If we could think of her as a managing woman of 50, we could seize her type at once, for we have plenty of managing women among us of that age who illustrate perfectly the sort of person she would have become had she lived. But she, being only a lass when all is said, lacked their knowledge of men's vanities and of the weight and proportion of social forces. She knew nothing of iron hands and velvet gloves. She just used her fists. She thought political changes much easier than they are, and like Mahomet in his innocence of any world but the tribal world, wrote letters to kings calling on them to make millennial rearrangements. Consequently, it was only in the enterprises that were really simple and compassable by swift physical force, like the coronation and the Orleans campaign, that she was successful. Her want of academic education disabled her when she had to deal with such elaborately artificial structures as the great ecclesiastical and social institutions of the Middle Ages. She had a horror of heretics without suspecting that she was herself a heresiarch, one of the precursors of a schism that rent Europe in two and cost centuries of bloodshed that is not yet staunched. She objected to foreigners on the sensible ground that they were not in their proper place in France, but she had no notion of how this brought her into conflict with Catholicism and feudalism, both essentially international. She worked by common sense, and where scholarship was the only clue to institutions she was in the dark, and broke her shins against them, all the more rudely because of her enormous self-confidence, which made her the least cautious of human beings in civil affairs. This combination of inept youth and academic ignorance with great natural capacity pushed, courage, devotion, originality, and oddity, fully accounts for all the facts in Joan's career and makes her a creditable historical and human phenomenon. But it clashes most discordantly both with the idolatrous romance that has grown up around her and the belittling skepticism that reacts against that romance. The Maid in Literature. English readers would probably like to know how these idolizations and reactions have affected the books they are most familiar with about Joan. There is the first part of the Shakespearean or pseudo-Shakespearean trilogy of Henry VI, in which Joan is one of the leading characters. This portrait of Joan is not more authentic than the description in the London papers of George Washington in 1780, of Napoleon in 1803, of the German Crown Prince in 1915, or of Lenin in 1917. It ends in mere scurrility. The impression left by it is that the playwright, having begun by an attempt to make Joan a beautiful and romantic figure, was told by his scandalized company that English patriotism would never stand a sympathetic representation of a French conqueror of English troops, and that unless he at once introduced all the old charges against Joan of being a sorceress and harlot, and assumed her to be guilty of all of them, his play could not be produced. As likely as not, this is what actually happened. Indeed, there is only one other apparent way of accounting for the sympathetic representation of Joan as a heroine culminating in her eloquent appeal to the Duke of Burgundy, followed by the blackguardly scurrility of the concluding scenes. That other way is to assume that the original play was wholly scurrilous, and that Shakespeare touched up the earlier scenes. As the work belongs to a period at which he was only beginning his practice as a tinker of old works, before his own style was fully formed and hardened, it is impossible to verify this guess. His finger is not unmistakably evident in the play, which is poor and base in its moral tone, but he may have tried to redeem it from downright infamy by shedding a momentary glamour on the figure of the maid. When we jump over 2 centuries to Schiller, we find Die Jungfrau von Orleans drowned in a witch's cauldron of raging romance. Schiller's Joan has not a single point of contact with the real Joan, nor indeed with any mortal woman that ever walked this earth. There is really nothing to be said of his play but that it is not about Joan at all, and can hardly be said to pretend to be, for he makes her die on the battlefield, finding her burning unbearable. Before Schiller came Voltaire, who burlesqued Homer in a mock epic called La Pucelle. It is the fashion to dismiss this with virtuous indignation as an obscene libel, and I certainly cannot defend it against the charge of extravagant indecorum. But its purpose was not to depict Joan, but to kill with ridicule everything that Voltaire righteously hated in the institutions and fashions of his own day. He made Joan ridiculous, but not contemptible, nor, comparatively, unchaste. And as he also made Homer and St. Peter and Saint Denis and the brave Dunois ridiculous, and the other heroines of the poem very unchaste indeed, he may be said to have let Joan off very easily. But indeed the personal adventures of the characters are so outrageous, and so Homerically free from any pretence at, or even possibility of, historical veracity, that those who affect to take them seriously only make themselves Pecksniffian. Samuel Butler believed the Iliad to be a burlesque of Greek jingoism and Greek religion, written by a hostage or a slave. And La Pucelle makes Butler's theory almost convincing. Voltaire represents Agnes Sorel, the Dauphin's mistress, whom Joan never met, as a woman with a consuming passion for the chastest concubinal fidelity, whose fate it was to be continually falling into the hands of licentious foes and suffering the worst extremities of rapine. The combats in which Joan rides a flying donkey, or in which, taken unaware with no clothes on, she defends Agnes with her sword, and inflicts appropriate mutilations on her assailants, can be laughed at, as they are intended to be, without scruple, for no sane person could mistake them for sober history, and it may be that their ribald irreverence is more wholesome than the beglamoured sentimentality of Schiller. Certainly Voltaire should not have asserted that Joan's father was a priest, but when he was out to harasser l'infâme, the French Church, he stuck at nothing. So far, the literary representations of the Maid were legendary, but the publication by Quisera in 1841 of the reports of her trial and rehabilitation placed the subject on a new footing. These entirely realistic documents created a living interest in Joan, which Voltaire's mock Homerics and Schiller's romantic nonsense missed. Typical products of that interest in America and England are the histories of Joan by Mark Twain and Andrew Lang. Mark Twain was converted to downright worship of Joan directly by Quisera. Later on, another man of genius, Anatole France, reacted against the Quixotic wave of enthusiasm and wrote a life of Joan in which he attributed Joan's ideas to clerical prompting and her military success to an adroit use of her by Dunois as a mascotte. In short, he denied that she had any serious military or political ability. At this, Andrew saw red and went for Anatole's scalp in a rival life of her, which should be read as a corrective to the other. Lang had no difficulty in showing that Joan's ability was not an unnatural fiction to be explained away as an illusion manufactured by priests and soldiers, but a straightforward fact. It has been lightly pleaded in explanation that Anatole France is a Parisian of the art world, into whose scheme of things the able, hard-headed, hard-handed female, though she dominates provincial France and business Paris, does not enter, whereas Lang was a Scot, and every Scot knows that the grey mare is as likely as not to be the better horse. But this explanation does not convince me. I cannot believe that Anatole France does not know what everybody knows. I wish everybody knew all that he knows. One feels antipathies at work in his book. He is not anti-Joan, but he is anti-clerical, anti-mystic, and fundamentally unable to believe that there ever was any such person as the real Joan. Mark Twain's Joan, skirted to the ground and with as many petticoats as Noah's wife in a toy ark, is an attempt to combine Bayard with Esther Summerson from Bleak House into an unimpeachable American schoolteacher in armor. Like Esther Summerson, she makes her creator ridiculous, and yet, being the work of a man of genius, remains a creditable human goody-goody in spite of her creator's infatuation. It is the description rather than the valuation that is wrong. Andrew Lang and Mark Twain are equally determined to make Joan a beautiful and most ladylike Victorian, but both of them recognize and insist on her capacity for leadership, though the Scots scholar is less romantic about it than the Mississippi pilot. But then Lang was, by lifelong professional habit, a critic of biographies rather than a biographer, whereas Mark Twain writes his biography frankly in the form of a romance. Protestant misunderstanding of the Middle Ages. They had, however, one disability in common. To understand Joan's history, it is not enough to understand her character. You must understand her environment as well. Joan in a 19th century environment is as incongruous a figure as she would appear were she to walk down Piccadilly today in her 15th century armor. To see her in her proper perspective, you must understand Christendom and the Catholic Church, the Holy Roman Empire and the feudal system as they existed and were understood in the Middle Ages. If you confuse the Middle Ages with the Dark Ages, and are in the habit of ridiculing your aunt for wearing medieval clothes, meaning those in vogue in the 1890s, and are quite convinced that the world has progressed enormously, both morally and mechanically, since Joan's time, then you will never understand why Joan was burnt, much less feel that you might have voted for burning her yourself if you had been a member of the court that tried